if you just do it, it'll turn out okay. And today, me and Julian are going less historical and more something else.
Ahistorical, a lot of it, I would say.
Before we get started, what have you been up to since we last met?
Well, I just yesterday made the first writer account for the Media Magpies website. So any day now, there will actually be a MediaMagpies.com with stuff on it.
Neat.
I've been continuing to post regular articles on our Patreon, which are they go up early access for $5 and up patrons, and they're free for the general public on release day. But that's what we've been doing, is we've been waiting on our web designer. Well, our coder, really.
I forgot to put your Patreon in the description. I'll do that afterwards.
That's fine.
As for me, I have been working on my editing skills, and I am working on a brand new version of our historical document series.
Cool.
With better audio, if I can figure out some animations and other stuff, and we can actually see this what we're talking about. We talk about each amendment or article or the declaration or whatever. Hopefully
I will definitely share those when you've got those.
But in the meantime, what got you into conspiracy theories or debunking them?
So I was in college, and I used to kind of browse the school library, which was kind of a pain because the Library of Congress system, while very, very helpful if you're doing any kind of nonfiction reading, is a super pain in the butt if you're doing fiction. Because with Dewey Decimal, the fiction is all separated out by author's last name. In Library of Congress, it's in there somewhere, and I've never fully figured out how to find the books you're actually looking for. So I spent a lot of time browsing the nonfiction shelves because, there is what there is. And I came across this book called Bad Astronomy by a man who I've chatted with online a few times over the years by the name of Phil Plait, the Bad Astronomer. And the book is mostly about the view of astronomy that people have that's wrong. Like how the only media to really get right most meteors is The Simpsons, the one where Bart picks up the cooled meteor and puts it in his pocket. That's more accurate and then everything is on fire. But there was a section in there about things like the moon landing and how there are people who believe the moon landing is not real. And so I read that book a few times, and then a couple years after I graduated, Mythbusters debuted. And I joined, because I'm an old, the Mythbusters message boards. And that was fun.
Wait for a second. For those who are too young to understand, tell us what message boards are.
So message boards, which honestly I think are better for any kind of substantive conversation than Discord or Facebook, but that's not just me being old. It's literally easier to organize these conversations. Is people would post basically kind of like posting a tweet or Facebook message or what have you about a topic, and then people would reply to that topic, and the replies would stay in chronological order by when they were posted, which is something Facebook has never figured out. And you'd be able to reply directly to people, and what you were replying to would get quoted, and it would stay in this very nice, precise order to keep the conversation linear and in one place. Big fan of the message board concept. Discord does not do it for me because it's too easy to lose the conversation completely. So, in the days when the Mythbusters show first went on the air, they had a very badly moderated message board. There was one moderator for all of the Discovery Channel message boards. And the Mythbusters one got something like 4 or 5 times the traffic as the entire rest of the Discovery Channel put together. It's a very busy board. And one of the big problems was it had this nanny software in place of having moderators. Yeah, Discord is way closer to a chat room, and it's a problem. So we couldn't use the word balls, regardless of context, because the nanny software just knew that that was a word that could have bad meanings, and so it would star it out. And if you've seen enough of the show, you start to realize why that's kind of a problem with some of the myths. Some of our conversations would not entirely make sense to an outside reader because some of the words that are perfectly normal in context couldn't be used according to the software. But one of the ones that started coming up fairly early into the show was people believing the moon landings had been faked. And from there, I would mention the Bad Astronomy book, and Phil does have well, I don't think he does anymore, but he had at the time a website, badastronomy.com. And I would recommend these to people, and other people in the group would recommend this website called clavius.org, run by the just absolutely wonderful Jay Windley. He and I have lost touch years ago, but I cannot say enough good things about Jay. And eventually, I joined what was, at the time, the Bad Astronomy message boards. Well, you know, you can watch it after the fact. Yeah, the chat software that we used for the Bad Astronomy board in one of its later incarnations replaced a certain scatological term with poop. And if you added an extra I, if, for example, you were talking about shiitake mushrooms, it turned into pu'utake mushrooms. It just added an extra O. And replaced the name of a certain world figure of the 1920s and 30s with Gandhi, except it's spelled Gandhi wrong. I have stories about that, chat. Nanny software is a whole other conversation. So I joined the Bad Astronomy board and started making friends there. And what the Bad Astronomy board did was kind of 3 different things. One was conversation of actual science. I saw a weird optical illusion with the moon at one point, and I asked on the board, hey, what's going on with this? One was a conversation of, as the book had done, bad astronomy in the media. And one was the against the mainstream and conspiracy theories section. Against the mainstream was science, and eventually got limited to astronomy. But it is why I know a whole lot about some of the weirder, like, we didn't get a lot of creationists in that group, but we got Expanding Earth, we got Electric Universe. Flurf wasn't really big at the time, so we didn't get Flurf, but they probably started getting it around the time that I left, which was like 3 or 4 years ago. So this was 2005, maybe. So I spent roughly 15 years as part of this group. I once got called the president of the clique, which I have thought was enormously funny ever since. And so I spent a lot of time hanging out with these people online and debunking weird conspiracy theories, weird against the mainstream scientific ideas. And the rule was, if I knew enough to know your science was wrong, you had real problems. Because this board had literal rocket scientists. And one of the handful of people from the group that I've met in person is a retired Boeing engineer. Like, did he work with Bill Nye? I don't remember, but he could have. And, you know, Jay, God's bless him, we had a running joke about the I corrected Jay t-shirt. And the other running joke was every time you said everyone is ignorant of something, which is true. No one can know everything. You had to say, even Jay is ignorant of, and then you had to find a new thing that Jay was ignorant of. And this got challenging because Jay is the smartest person I have ever known and the most knowledgeable person I have ever known. And so we were going into things like, you know, the history of cheese hoop making. And every once in a while you'd come up with one that you thought that Jay could not possibly know anything about. He'd say, well, actually, I took a class on that in college or whatever. And you'd be like, well, of course you did. So, you know, I don't do the science as well as some people do. Bob B, I can't remember what the B stands for, but he had this site that was detailing like all of this orbital mechanics stuff, and I never understood any of that. But I can do a higher than surface level debunking of any mainstream conspiracy theory based on my years on that board. And I came away with some fantastic stories.
So was the rocket scientist part of the moon landing people?
Oh no! This was on the side of most of the people on the board believed that the moon landing was real, believed in mainstream science, believed that relativity is real. We had one moderator who was a creationist, and that used to drive me crazy because they should not have allowed a creationist moderator. But I also spent a lot of years on a board called Apollo Hoax, where the original board had been started by a hoax believer who was later convinced that they were wrong, which I always really admired. I hope you feel better, Alma. And then someone else took it over, and for weeks at a time, we would not have a single hoax believer. It would just kind of be us talking amongst ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, I think my one of my favorite debunking things I heard about the moon landing thing was how if it was a movie, apparently the movie is so good it's better than our technology nowadays.
It really is. That's the thing, is like, I can't claim to know the, thermodynamics or the computer. That's all Jay. Jay knows all that stuff. And I'm pretty sure Clavius is still up if anybody wants to read it. But I was able to step in and say things like, okay, let's talk about filmmaking. I'm not a huge Jay knows more than I do in that subject too, but I know enough so that I can step in and say, okay, but see, here's where the technology was, and let's compare it with this, that, and the other thing. And, the running joke was, yeah, the moon landings were actually faked by Stanley Kubrick, but he was such a perfectionist that he demanded that it actually be shot on the moon. Also, it absolutely could not have been filmed by Stanley Kubrick because Buzz Aldrin would have punched him. Hills I will die on. Buzz Aldrin and Stanley Kubrick could never have worked together. Buzz never would have put up with 115 takes of anything, which was a Kubrick, literally that happened. A lot of conspiracism. So, first off, there is no direct correlation between conspiracism and intelligence. That's the thing I need to get out there first thing. There are a lot of very smart people who fall for conspiracy theories. Moon landing hoax, the hoax belief is not as big as it used to be. A lot of those people have gone, well, these days a lot of them I suspect are QAnon, but a lot of them shifted more into World Trade Center trutherism and all kinds of nonsense.
So, is it mainly the flat earthers that debunk the moon landing now?
Yeah, the flat earthers are the big we didn't land on the moon because we couldn't have, because the moon isn't what they tell it, blah 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 blah. And they're starting from so far back that you can't even get to the moon landing because if they don't accept that the Earth is round, they're not going to accept any of the other stuff you have to bring forward. There are some conspiracists who are legitimately mentally ill. There are not a lot, in my experience. And I'm not qualified to diagnose. Let's be very clear about this. I was an English major in college. I am not a medical professional, and even if I were, it is actually against the rules of the American Psychiatric Association to diagnose someone you haven't met. That is written in the rules. I wouldn't do it if I were a mental health professional. However, there are a few people you can't help thinking to yourself, there's something wrong with you as you interact with them. What am I overreaching on, Tom? That these people aren't intelligent, that they aren't mental. I need more clarification of what you're saying. I'm overreaching on, but it is in, I believe, the current DSM, the DSM-5, which is the big book of mental health, basically. That extreme conspiracism to the point where it is damaging your day-to-day life is a mental illness, but just being a conspiracist does not make you mentally ill. And as a mentally ill person, not all mentally ill people are conspiracists. But yes, I have interacted with people over the years who believe that the moon landing is fake. They are wrong. In a lot of cases, I think it's because they like thinking that they know something that other people don't. In a lot more cases, it's because they think they're smarter than they actually are and refuse to acknowledge that they could be wrong. One of the rules on the board was, if you are presenting the conspiracy, if you are presenting the against the mainstream hypothesis, you have to answer any pertinent questions. And I don't know was considered a legitimate answer. And the sheer number of people who were banned from that board because they refused to just freaking say, I don't know. They wouldn't say, I don't know. And they would get angrier and angrier that they were being asked these questions that they clearly didn't know the answer to. And they could never admit that they were wrong. And eventually that would lead to these blow-ups where they ended up getting banned for, if they could have just said, let me look into that, everything could have been solved. So, that was my experience in it. Is most of these people like being on the inside, and a lot of them like thinking that there is a rational agent controlling life.
Yeah. Well, um, well, some conspiracies are we actually can call silly.
Oh,
Others,
some of them are, believe me.
but other ones are a bit more dangerous
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
spreading.
Um, the guy who thought that the Cold War was faked, that was silly. But blood libel, which is a conspiracy theory, let's be very, very clear here, it's a centuries old conspiracy that is causing demonstrable harm. The idea that the Jews do this and that, and the original blood libel was that Jews killed unbaptized Christian children to make uh, unleavened bread for Passover. That is the original blood libel. And obviously, let's be very clear, that's not true. Logically, it can't be true, because how did they make unleavened bread before they had Christians to bake it out of? Like, the timeline does not work on that. But even leaving that aside, it's not true. It has never been true. But it has killed millions of people over the years, because that ties into the anti-Semitism of Martin Luther, which ties into, Germany in the 30s and 40s. Like, blood libel has been killing people for centuries. That's a conspiracy theory that is a problem. Anti-vax is a conspiracy theory, and it's killing people. Today, people are dying because they will not vaccinate themselves and vaccinate their kids. Nobody's dying because they don't think Shakespeare wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. That doesn't, it's wrong, but it's basically harmless.
Yeah. I had two responses for the vaccine theories to people, and they told me this. The first one was vaccines give you autism. And I said, well, I'd rather have autism than polio.
Well, yeah. Not only that, but measles can cause a kind of encephalitis that's got to be at least as bad as autism.
Yeah.
On top of, I have a friend who, I've known this guy since he was in 8th grade and I was a junior in high school. We go way back. And his son is a year or so younger than my son, his older son. And they live in our hometown of Pasadena, California still. And he and his family have traditionally been annual pass holders at Disneyland. And they did not take, I can name them because they've been on the news a bunch of times, but my friend Chris and his wife Ariel did not take their son to Disneyland until after they got him his pertussis shot, because whooping cough, which is what pertussis is, could be so much less prevalent than it is now, but people don't get the shot. And so it is a lot more common, even than it was, when I was a kid, when we were kids. The problem is MMR, which is the measles, mumps, rubella shot, is a 12-month vaccine. They won't give it to children under 12 months of age. And my friends Chris and Ariel took their 4-month son to Disneyland, and he got measles in the big Disneyland measles outbreak, 8 or 9 years ago. And the internet went freaking nuts. because Chris and Ariel went on the news. Chris and Ariel were very open. This is our son Mobius. This is the pictures of Mobius with measles. Yeah, that's true, Tom Tom. I know I've spoken to a lot of intelligent people who fall for conspiracy theories. I'm not saying everyone who falls for them is intelligent. I'm saying being smart doesn't make you immune from them. We've seen intelligent people fall for conspiracy. We've also seen total idiots fall for them.
Yeah.
There's no...
It's not a one-to-one thing.
Yeah, it's absolutely not. There's some smart people, some not so smart people, and a lot of people in between, just like the regular world.
Yeah.
But so
you wouldn't believe how many people I went to school with that were arguing with me about how the COVID vaccine is stupid and dangerous and all.
Oh, yeah, no, I would, because I'm okay, so I'm still on Facebook because I'm an old. But, this was also 10 years ago when a lot more people were on Facebook. Chris and Ariel were very, very open about their experiences, and one of the things that was happening was that their friends were seeking out the dumbest takes they could find online to present to Chris and Ariel like a present. And it was hilarious, some of the takes that I was seeing. But basically, the internet became convinced that these close personal friends of mine, well, I've never actually met Ariel, but, this guy I've known since he was in 8th grade is an actor, which technically he was, because the time when I met him, he was playing Rooster in his junior high production of Annie. But Ariel is not an actress. Ariel is a registered nurse. And Moby is a real baby. Well, was a real baby. He's a real, 5th grader now. These were real people living their real lives. And the internet said that they were shills for Big Pharma. They didn't exist. They, the whole 9 yards. My personal favorite take was the person who said, and they had turned off comments on their blog, which mark of cowardice, but they had said that they weren't sure if this Chris Loop person, because that's my friend's name, Chris Loop, this Chris Loop person was real or not. And his wife Ariel was real or not. But he found it really suspicious that they had named their child Mobius Loop, which they did. I remember the day I found out they were going to do that, and I remember my reaction being, oh, of course he is. So, and whatever happened to people naming their children after saints like they used to, which is a very specific perspective. But, it's all these kids named, well, Mobius, as if there's tons of those running around. And, Logan and Aiden. And I thought to myself, wait a minute.
After movie stars or TV stars.
Well, the thing is Aiden is an Irish name. And if there's one thing Irish history teaches us is that there's no Irish name that doesn't have a saint with that name. So I looked it up. And Saint Aiden was actually at Lindisfarne when the Vikings raided. So Aiden is a saint's name. So, yeah. So that's my personal favorite, just because it was like, you're not making the point you think you are. But I got to watch in real time the internet decide that someone I have known since, mathing here, that'd be, 1994, didn't exist. And that's amazing to watch.
Yeah, for me, it was different. Talking about the COVID thing, it was like they all told me it takes years or decades for a vaccine to be developed. Last time it took forever. I'm like, yeah, last time 20 years ago, our computers had a 5 GB hard drive. We thought it was a big deal. Medical technology advances.
Well, and the groundwork for the COVID vaccine, if you actually look into this, the groundwork for that vaccine had been done over the space of 20 years. And it was just that.
Oh, of course.
Thank you.
And then in half an
Just
hour.
a sec.
Be back with these messages.
Sorry, my partner and Zane just got home from doing the week's grocery shopping. So.
Hi.
So, the concept of an mRNA vaccine was something that they've been working on for a long time, and it just happened to be that it was relatively easy to plug this little bit of the COVID vaccine in and make a functional vaccine relatively quickly. And we don't have an AIDS vaccine because we don't have the capability of doing that, in part because of how quickly the AIDS, HIV mutates.
Oh, I thought it was because this is just me was because most vaccines trigger the white blood cells and stuff to got the vaccine, but the problem is that the AIDS virus or HIV virus it goes after the white blood cells.
Yeah, it's most conspiracy theorists, conspiracists, believe what they do because they have a misunderstanding. Like, this is not why they are the kind of person who gets into conspiracism, but like when we're watching, say, Kent Hovind, because young Earth creationism at this point is another conspiracy theory, because you have to accept that all of these people are either lying or wrong in order for your version to be right. And that's one of the core things that is the difference between a conspiracy theory and just a conspiracy. Because conspiracies are real. I don't want to ever claim that they are not. If we're going to talk conspiracies, let's talk, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis study. That is a real conspiracy that did real demonstrable harm, and it was through the government. That's real. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about conspiracy theory. The kind of conspiracy theory we're talking about is the kind where the scientific consensus or, whatever says this one thing, and you say, well, but what if no? So when Kent Hovind says, well, the scientists believe you come from a rock, he's not he's not understanding the difference between evolution and abiogenesis, but that's the list of things Kent fails to understand is a long one. It's also, he fails to understand what abiogenesis actually is, what evolution actually is.
What taxes actually are.
Right. And by the way, literally no one in anti-creationism circles does not have a Kent Hovind impersonation, because it's really easy. You just pronounce water strangely and you're in. But with the moon hoax, you'd get people who didn't understand orbital mechanics, which I don't either, but that's fine. Who didn't understand really basic stuff. The correct understanding of vaccines is that they work. And that vaccines are one of the greatest tools for human health and safety that the world has ever known. And the reason the side with that understanding has a hard time communicating it is because there are people who don't want to listen. Why they don't want to listen is its own question. And I don't believe there's a single answer to that. I have seen too many different answers to say that, yes, I have interacted with people who were clearly paranoid schizophrenics. And that's why they didn't believe reality was what it was, because their own brain was lying to them. I've interacted with people who I'm convinced were just lying. They were either trolling or grifting. And it was not in their best interests to admit that they were wrong. I've dealt with a lot of people who I couldn't tell you why they believed what they did. But I could tell you for sure that they were not willing to listen to people who told them where they were wrong. My favorite example of this, I dealt with this guy many years ago who believed that the surface of the sun was made of solid iron. Now, we can all agree, no matter what our feelings are about pretty much anything else, that the surface of the sun being solid iron is wrong. Because that's bonkers. And we would talk to this guy. I went back and forth with this guy over literally months, along with the entire rest of the group. It wasn't just me, which is good because, as established, I'm not a scientist. But what I eventually found out was that he was basing his entire belief on a series of artificial color pictures from a NASA probe imaging the sun. Now, I am not an expert on artificial colors for results and things like that, because of course I'm not. English major, we established this. However, in another one of those weird, and here's how I'm tangentially tied into something actually important to the discussion, I grew up in the town of Altadena, California, which is right next to Pasadena, California, which is where the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is based. And JPL, and I believe now you actually have to get tickets because it's such a big thing and it's so cool and so interesting. But they do an open house every year. And you can actually go, and they don't let you go everywhere because of course they don't. But you know, I was able to look through the observation windows at the Hubble being built. And I saw a test of concept of the Mars rover in their parking lot. And you can go and see the rooms where they track all these satellites. It's a really cool experience. And if you were ever able to go, I cannot recommend it highly enough. However, one of the things that happened when I was a kid, and I still have the picture somewhere, is they took my picture with both a regular camera. The line for this was probably 45 minutes or longer long, but they took my picture with a regular camera and with artificial coloring software that they used for, I think, Voyager, but I could be wrong. And in that picture, I am purple and orange. And I know you guys can't, my avatar kind of is purple and orange. And I know I don't turn my camera on for lots of reasons, but I am a human. That dragon picture is not me. I am not purple and orange. I am human. And so I was able to say, hey, here's why you can't trust the colors that they're showing to tell you anything about the picture. And here's why, the filters that they're using on this picture may not be telling you exactly what you think it is. I was able to work through it very, very clearly. Here's the information I have, and it's a very surface level information, but it's enough to say, you are coming at this from the wrong angle. And he never responded. I think it's one of the reasons he ended up getting banned. It was a time of much upheaval, and for various reasons, he ended up getting banned 3 or 4 different times. But one of the times, I'm pretty sure, was in part because he would not respond to my, hey, friend, Michael Mosina, I believe his name was. Here is the information that proves that what you're relying on is not true. And I could talk for hours about why COVID denialism, anti-vaxxing, and all of that is in fact 100% equivalent to people who doubt the moon landing. But 99% of the people who are COVID denialists and who are anti-vaxxers will not hear what I am saying because they believe what they want to, and they do not want to be told how they are wrong. Now, I haven't read Andrew Wakefield's MMR study. Don't have to. It's garbage. It's been retracted by the journal that published it. But I am able to look at a lot of the studies regarding the COVID vaccine and tell you we're not dying in droves because of the COVID vaccine. Yes, autism rates are increasing. That's because how and when and why we diagnose has changed, and how often we diagnose has changed. There are a lot of people my age who were never diagnosed because that was just not something that happened back in the day. So yeah, more people are diagnosed. That's a change in the healthcare system, not in actual rates of autism. That is a known factor that is easy to account for. But if I tell an anti-vaxxer that, and I have, they don't listen because they have made up their mind. You want to know what it would take to convince me that vaccines cause autism? You'd have to start with a correlation between vaccines and autism. And there isn't one. The Amish famously don't vaccinate. Amish kids still get autism. I'm vaccinated. I don't have autism. So there's got to be something else, because otherwise, what are we even doing? There are so many vaccinated people who are fine, but that doesn't change the mindset of the anti-vax person, because they don't want to have that mindset change, because they would have to admit they're wrong.
Yeah.
I never said they're connected to one another. I said they're both conspiracism. The mindset is connected. The mindset of, I believe this thing, regardless of the evidence, regardless of what I'm being told, is absolutely 100% connected. Also, the strongest correlation with believing one conspiracy is believing another conspiracy. The joke in our group was that they're like potato chips. Nobody can believe just one.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that the CIA killed Kennedy, you're more likely to believe that the moon landing was faked. If you believe that vaccines cause autism, you're more likely to believe that JFK Jr. is still alive. That is just... Tom, I don't think you understand that we are not having a debate. Like, I see the questions that you are asking me here, but that's not what I'm doing here. I'm not here to debate whatever position you hold. What I'm here to do is to talk about some of my experiences. Mostly what I wanted to do was tell funny stories. And yeah, I have to present a certain amount of background to get into where these stories come from. But that doesn't mean I want to spend all of my time sitting here saying, well, study X, Y, Z, because I don't have it all handy, because that's not what I was here to do. There are studies that show that a certain mindset goes along with all of this. They're actually fairly easy to find if you want to. But what it feels like here, something I've gone through before, is you want to believe that your conspiracy isn't the same as that crazy conspiracy over there. And a lot of times they aren't. I have a friend whose mother believes that Antarctica isn't real. And believing that Francis Bacon wrote the plays of Shakespeare and believing that Antarctica isn't real are very different. But there is still a certain amount of once you actually start reading the scholarship, yeah, it's connected.
Would you consider the witch hunts of the medieval age and the Salem like conspiracy theories or something else?
Oh, so we don't actually know what caused those. I don't think it's. First off, let's be clear: they weren't witches. They weren't even. I'm a pagan, and a lot of my fellow neo-pagans have this whole thing where we want to claim the victims of. No. They were, to their own mind, just as good separatists as all of the other separatists of Salem. They were not pagans, they were not witches, they were not any of that stuff. They were Christians. One of the victims died after reciting the Our Father because it was believed at the time that witches couldn't say the Lord's Prayer. And he thought that actually reciting the Lord's Prayer would prove everyone wrong. So they were Christians. They were just, probably it was about land and inheritance and local politics and stuff you have to really get into the weeds of 17th century history to understand. So, yes, after a certain point, the witch trials were conspiracism, but it's also a lot of the mindset that their religion set them up to have. And I do not want to have the conversation about whether religion is a conspiracy theory, because my short answer is it depends. And my long answer is please don't make me talk about this.
Yeah. Moving on that topic, I guess it depends on where you draw the line between a cult and a religion.
Right, and there are a lot of people who think that using the word cult to describe any religious group is a bad idea for reasons, and not my field. I know a certain amount of the history, and I know a certain amount of theology, and getting that far into it is above my pay grade.
If you do want to pay her, come to our Patreon. Just kidding. But so we talked about flat Earth. We talked about the moon landing. We talked about COVID. We talked about the witch trials.
Mm-hmm.
What other ones are out there? The line we talked about. I think you went to 9/11.
9/11. Yeah. Eventually, we banned that from our group because, well, for one thing, the leadership made the decision that it needed to be space-based conspiracy theories because there was a no politics rule, and it's really hard to talk about a lot of modern conspiracy theories without getting into politics. But 9/11 does give me another of my favorite stories, which is the person who decided that the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers were built with explosive rebar, and that they were demolished using a big red, literally, we asked, a big red button in the basement to bring them down. They said they weren't sure if it was big and red, but yes, there was a self-destruct button in the World Trade Center, in case you didn't know. And it was built with exploding rebar. And we said, oh, that's interesting. Because once they've made that argument, what do? Like, is there any way to disprove that? And the answer is no, probably not. And certainly not to that person's satisfaction. Because, again, this is all my personal experience. If you want to go into the weeds of, the studies, the common denominator with all of them is it just is. That is the belief from all of these people, and you can say, well, what about such and such? Well, that's just not a problem. Or they just solved it. And they will make any kind of excuse. There is this belief of absolute competence and absolute incompetence, depending on which one you need in any given moment. There's a woman, I can't remember her name, who used to claim that she watched the Apollo 11 landing live and she saw a Coke bottle in the footage. And no other version of the footage had the Coke bottle in it. And the Coke bottle was supposedly either incompetence on someone's part or a deliberate whistleblower. So you have to believe that the people who sent up the Apollo missions were capable of, moon rock samples that can fool experts from around the world in geology and, radio telemetry that fools everyone from Boy Scouts to the Soviet Union, all of whom tracked the Apollo landers. All of these other things, but they weren't competent to keep a Coke bottle off the set.
Oh. That reminds me of something else. Early conspiracy theories about when Soviet Union launched Sputnik, we thought it was like something dangerous.
Yeah, and the thing is people nowadays are more likely to believe that Sputnik was fake than people in those days were likely to believe in that moment that it is, if you see what I mean, fake, because Sputnik was a naked eye object. How could you tell that Sputnik was real? You looked up and you saw it. But at, 60, 70, 80-year removes, it becomes easier and easier to say, well, but how do we know that's what really happened?
Like, for example, the Holocaust deniers.
The Holocaust deniers. And that one was banned from the board before I got there. Because there's some garbage you don't invite into your board. And that's another one where they come in a lot. And that's another commonality in a lot of these conspiracies is they. And the one thing I'll say is that at least Holocaust denialism is pretty open about who they are. Because in Holocaust denial, they are the Jews. In a lot of other conspiracy theories, they might be the Jews, but we're never actually going to say that. I don't actually believe that the root of all conspiracism is anti-Semitism. I think that is an oversimplification. But I will say the root of a lot of conspiracism is anti-Semitism. I've been watching some of the Armored Skeptic Done Lost His Mind videos lately, and there's one where he's talking about the people who control the world, and he's talking about how he's not a bigot, but then one of the groups he has of the people who control the world is the Rothschilds, and it's like, oh no. Because the Rothschilds are a dog whistle for anti-Semitism.
Like the space laser lady?
Like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is, she's a piece of work. They can control the weather, Side note, people who believe that you can control a hurricane are not aware of how much energy is in a hurricane. And like I keep saying, a lot of these conspiracies, there's a really important level of misunderstanding. A conspiracy theory also requires scope. My neighbor is plotting to, knock over Fort Knox. It's not a conspiracy theory, even if I posit that she's got 15 or 20 people she's going to do it with, because that's just not what a conspiracy theory is. A conspiracy theory requires something on a much larger scale, something that involves a lot of people, and something that goes against the evidence. I just don't know. For all I know, my neighbor is plotting to knock over Fort Knox. She's not going to succeed, but she could be plotting for all I know. But, you know.
Off topic, is Fort Knox still relevant nowadays?
You know, I suspect it's a lot less relevant than it used to be because we're not on a gold standard. There was a time when Fort Knox was exceedingly relevant, and I don't think that's really as true as it was, you know, a few decades ago, even. You know, fiat currency being what it is.
I guess a less dangerous, silly conspiracy would be the Area 51 Roswell. There's aliens under the thing conspiracy.
Yeah, and now I've always been very. This is another one where, like, I can tell you exactly what it would take to change my mind. And after about 10 years of being involved in these groups, what I started doing was asking people what it would take to change their mind. And 99% of the time, either there was no answer, or the answer was something that either contradicts, you know, what we're talking about, or is not possible in some way, or in fun and entertaining cases was something that had already been done, but they weren't accepting it. Because, you know, you get people who would say, well, if the moon landings were real, why did we only go once? I said, well, you know they didn't, right? Like, you know, they went back repeatedly. Did you not see Apollo 13? I thought everybody saw Apollo 13. And the only Apollo mission they could name was Apollo 1 and Apollo 11, and they were completely unaware of all of the others, and so they would be asking for evidence that was produced in other Apollo missions.
They skipped 1 to 11.
Yeah. They skipped 1 to 11, and they didn't know about anything past 11, even 13 somehow, despite, you know, Oscars involved. And so it's like when you argue with a creationist and you get, well, I want a dog to be born from a cat. Well, but that's not what I'm saying would happen. You see how that's not what I'm saying would happen, right? And so you get this kind of, it's not universal, but there were people who didn't even understand what they were arguing against, even for you to be able to unpick their arguments. You know, you couldn't even say, hey, you're it's like when creation myths went on probably standing for truth, and Kent was giving his whole thing about how DNA passes from generation to generation, and it was so wrong that he's like, you know what, I'm noping out of this conversation entirely because I don't want to have to start from high school biology. And I've been in conversations where it's like, there's so much I would have to teach you in order to tell you how you're wrong that just, you know what, believe what you want. I don't even care anymore. The guy who believed you couldn't see light in space. The guy who believed the entirety of the Cold War was faked. In my experience, a thing that I used to do was make conspiracy theories make sense. Like, rearrange things so that the conspiracy could be true.
Yeah, the two of us, we grew up at the tail end. Two of us grew up at the tail end of the Cold War when everything was running down.
Yeah. Well, and I was one of the younger people in that group, and so there were a lot of people who had been, you know, serving in the military during the Cold War and things like that. They're like, excuse me.
Yeah,
you know,
I think I was 9 when I watched the Berlin Wall fall down.
I'd have to. So it was 1989, I think, but I don't remember what time of year it was. I know where I was. I just don't remember for sure how old I was.
I think it was May. I might be wrong. It was something.
I was in the ER. I was getting a piece of glass taken out of my foot when the Berlin Wall came down. So, yeah, memories. But with the there was no Cold War guy, you have to start from so far back to teach him how he's wrong that it's just easier to let him be wrong. But a lot of these other people, you get closer and closer and they're accepting a lot, and the way you try to help them through this is you try to find the places where you agree with them.
Yeah. So how do you know when and where to say just to laugh it off or just between laughing it off? This.
I mean, it's different from person to person. And I mean that in both senses. I mean, where I draw the line versus where someone else draws the line is going to be different, and where I've drawn the line with one person versus where I've drawn the line with another has been different. There are some people where I have said to myself, this person is unwell and I'm not comfortable continuing this conversation. There are some people where I've said, this person is lying to me about what they believe, and it's not worth it to me to continue this conversation. It's not funny to me, but it is clearly funny to them. Everything else pretty much is a shade of gray about where you just stop having the conversation. My best friend's mother, before Zane was born, was talking to me about vaccines. And she tried to convince me to not get him vaccinated against polio. On the ground of she knew she couldn't talk me out of vaccinating.
Yeah, I have a friend whose mom has polio, so
my mom probably had polio as a child. She probably had a subclinical case. Like, they just thought she had a cold, but a podiatrist actually told her that the way that her feet are messed up is a sign of having a mild case of polio. My favorite aunt had polio as a child and was lucky not to be paralyzed. She had a much worse case than my mom did. She had to go to physical therapy over her case. Another aunt goes on faith healing vacations, which, but she's not an anti-vaxxer because she remembers polio.
Yeah.
And to people who are old enough to remember the 50s, the difference in pre-Salk and post-Salk is so enormous that it's hard not to accept that the vaccine helped. There are people who do, but even a lot of anti-medicine people in other ways will say, yeah, no, I think those vaccines actually do some good. Hi, Eddie. Don't know why all boomers are from Minnesota. I go to voice boomers. But they are.
When I was talking with Vice Rhino a few years ago about vaccines and stuff, we talked about how the two of us, obviously you two, we just missed the chickenpox vaccine by a few years.
Yeah. I had chickenpox. Vaccine was in the early 90s, as I recall, and I had it my dad was still alive, and he died in 83. So
I had mine in the early 80s too.
My older sister got it. She was in second grade. My older sister got chickenpox, and then she gave it to me. And then my younger sister was 18 months old and got it. And we managed to get it in such a way so that, and I don't know for sure, I know Elaine got it first, but I don't know for sure whether my younger sister or I got it next. But we managed to get it in such a way that it was literally the very last day of the possible incubation period from the previous sister. The next sister came down with it.
Yeah,
And I don't want to go back to that. Thank you. I'm happy with vaccines.
I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory or not, but I remember a lot of people talking about how it was dangerous for adults to get it or something.
It is. Yeah. A lot of what we think of as harmless childhood illnesses, if you get them as an adult, are far more likely to kill you. There was a children's librarian in my hometown. The Altonino children's librarian had never had chickenpox. And the going theory was that she probably had, and just, it was so long ago and she was probably so young at the time and blah, blah, blah. But failing that, she quite possibly was naturally immune. There are some people who possibly are. But I got a babysitting job once from one of the other librarians because Jackie was her normal babysitter, but her kids had chickenpox and she was not going to have Jackie babysit her kids and possibly die. So I had chickenpox so I could babysit. And my kids have been vaccinated for... Actually, I know for a fact my son got his first chickenpox vaccine at his 12-month appointment, because I was really looking forward to MMR, but they won't do chickenpox and MMR at the same appointment. And chickenpox is still a lot more common than measles. So they gave him the vaccine of what he was more likely to get first. Full disclosure, my son has actually been diagnosed with autism, but the diagnosis is probably wrong. And anyway, his sister got vaccinated too, and she doesn't have autism. So here we are. And as established, I was vaccinated, not for chickenpox, but I was vaccinated for the stuff you could be vaccinated for when I was younger and get flu shots. My aunt, my mom's sister, actually had chickenpox twice. Usually that means your first case was mild, but apparently in my Aunt Jane's case, it did not.
So, does shingles count chickenpox if you have to have it that first? Is that the same thing or something different?
Yeah, it's the same virus. So there is legitimately room for discussion about, people who've been vaccinated for chickenpox and what that will do with shingles, and we don't 100% know, but there's a shingles vaccine now, so presumably developed at the same time as the chickenpox one. So in theory, I could get a shingles vaccine and be fine.
Yeah, the problem is you have to be, I think you have to be old to even get it now, but
yeah.
I know some people got shingles when they were in their 30s now.
I'm still too young for them to give me the vaccine, so...
I know, but I still understand why they wait till you're 50 or 60 to get it if people get it when they're younger.
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm really down on people who go on about big pharma on the grounds of, it's dismissive and it's too easy a scapegoat.
Yeah.
The pharmaceutical industry has a lot of problems, but also, for one thing, vaccines don't make the pharmaceutical industry money. They lose money on vaccination because treating illness is always financially better for them than preventing it.
Yeah, I was lucky because of my asthma and stuff. I got to get the pneumonia vaccine earlier than usual. It said I was a higher risk for it, so they gave it to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I need to arrange to get my flu shot. Can't get a COVID booster right now because I got COVID earlier this year and it hasn't been long enough. But on the other hand,
a new place. The pharmacy I usually go to closed down in the summertime. I haven't found a new one I can get to easily yet. So I am way behind this year in that.
I have a problem because I'm on disability and because insurance is the way it is. No, you cannot go there, miss. Sorry, the kitten was trying to climb onto my keyboard. Because of things like that, I have to go into my doctor's office to get my shots. I can't go to a pharmacy. And it's stupid and inefficient, and I have problems. But, so I am not claiming the pharmaceutical industry is perfect. That's another common issue with a lot of the conspiracy theorists I've dealt with over the years, is that they have a very black and white mentality. So Werner von Braun is a real stumbling block for a lot of them. For those who are unaware, after World War II, the United States went out of their way to recruit scientists who had worked with, let's call it the outgoing German regime, in a program called Operation Paperclip. And a lot of the scientists that the US got were rocket scientists. Most notably, Werner von Braun, who had been in charge of the V2 rocket program that, bombed London a little. And no, he did not found NASA, despite what people may tell you. But yes, he was one of the scientists who worked with NASA. There's actually, and it's on Disney Plus to this day, which is just, there's Wonderful World of Disney episodes with Werner von Braun, actually probably literal war criminal. So, I keep saying that Walt's anti-Semitism is way overblown because Henry Ford is standing right there. But, oh look, it's Werner von Braun on Disney programming anyway. So that's a lot. But because Werner von Braun worked, on the V2 program, that led a lot of conspiracists to say, well, obviously it was fake because something Nazi. It's like, that's not actually how that works.
Well, I thought it'd be more like the Nazis are really control of NASA type of thing.
I mean, exactly the stripe they go for varies a lot. And not all hoax believers will necessarily cite Werner von Braun in any way. Some will, some won't. Yes, I see you. Sorry, letting my kitten out. Go. But the ones that do want to make it very clear, because Werner von Braun, something NASA is evil. And Florforce do this to a certain extent as well. It's like, well, okay, Werner von Braun was, let's go with morally dubious at best. But one of the other people who appears in those Disney specials was Jewish and fled the Nazis. And he worked for NASA too. It's any organization full of large people is going to be a lot more complex than black and white.
Like the creationists, all atheists are evolutionists and all Christians are creationists thing.
Exactly. And it's like, look, my 80-year-old Catholic mother is a lifelong acceptor of evolution. I don't know what you people want. But of course she's Catholic, so she's not really Christian anyway. It's fine. But you get a lot of this black and white thinking. You get a lot of this denial of evidence. You get a lot of anti-elitism. And elite is a really loaded word. But the fact is, a lot of people are where they are in part because they have brains. Like I've said, Jay Windley, smartest person I have ever known. And the work that he has done in the space program and in structural engineering, he earned every job he has ever gotten in those jobs. And yes, we could also have a conversation about all the smart people who can't get those jobs because, circumstances prevent them, and poverty and school to prison pipeline, and it's a whole other conversation. But, there is a belief in a lot of circles that if you are an intellectual or a politician or something like that, you are by definition corrupt. And I don't go that far. I don't think you can break it down to that black and white. And a lot of conspiracists disagree with me there.
What's the biggest argument you've had with a conspiracy theorist?
Well, there is the running joke about the shill check, and that is certainly the longest running one. Clearly, we're all paid off for believing what we do. I'm fortunate enough to not have really interacted with any eugenicists because, as a mentally ill, physically handicapped person, I have feelings about eugenics. I think I have to go with the anti-medicine stuff. That I'm like Dapper there. I can't really keep my cool about anti-medicine stuff. I am well established in my film group, which is not a place you would expect where, we all make jokes about the guy who actually believes the nonsense in Oliver Stone's JFK. Because boy, is that movie wrong about things. But what I am best known for in that group probably is my anti-Tom Cruise stance. I don't like any Scientology in some way. Or, I don't like any Scientologist. I'm going to side-eye at least a little bit. But Tom Cruise, I have really passionate feelings about because the church uses him to give them a wholesome, clean-cut, all-American image. And, there was this dialogue around the Top Gun sequel about how Tom Cruise saved cinema. I was like, well, that may or may not be true. I personally don't believe it's true. But what is certainly true is this list of crimes that we know that he and members of the church have committed. His house, when he was still married to Nicole Kidman, his house got remodeled using Sea Org members. And that is literal slave labor. But also the Church of Scientology kills mentally ill people by denying them their medication, by, trying to get it harder to get treatment. The reason Tom Cruise is not in Spielberg movies anymore is that Tom Cruise found out where Spielberg's kids went for therapy or medication or whatever, mental health treatment. And members of the church picketed Spielberg's kids' doctor's office. So I lose my cool over the anti-medical stuff. So if you think I'm ignoring you because you happen to believe anti-medical nonsense, yeah, probably I am, because otherwise I'm just going to start screaming, and I can't be, I have the information to refute it, but it's a lot harder for me to stay calm enough to present the information to refute it. Mm-hmm. I can talk about the guy who believes that the reason there were no dust clouds in the Apollo footage was that they had washed the sand and removed all the dust for hours. It's a lot harder for me to talk about anti-vaxxing and anti-psychiatric care and things along those lines, because that is the one that does the most real-world harm. And I'm gonna say something that's probably not something a lot of people thought of, is 90% of the American population doesn't really care about most of this stuff. Anti-vax has touched them, But if you ask the average American, the average person really worldwide, maybe it's different in the UK, who wrote Shakespeare's plays, they don't care. If you say, do you think someone other than Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays? They haven't thought about it. Why would they think about it? That's not relevant. The anti-medical stuff is relevant to their lives. And, like I said, believing one statistically is shown to make people believe more conspiracies. And we see the harm of that with things like QAnon. QAnon, kids, is a bonkers conspiracy theory. And it's causing real world harm today.
Yeah,
And,
I did a Venn diagram once comparing anti-vaxxers, YCers, and flat earthers.
yeah. And it's not fully a circle, in part because there are still some weird leftist people.
Yeah, that's the thing. For the longest time, I thought anti-vaxxers was really a left-leaning thing.
It's always just been at the extremes.
Yeah, but then after this more recent years, the church people are going anti-vaxxers. I'm like,
yeah. Well, and that's been true for a long time. It's just more prominent these days. But you want a fun rabbit hole to go down? Look up anti-smallpox vaccine propaganda.
Yeah, for the longest time I knew that was a thing, but I thought that they were the extreme right wingers, like people that thought prayer, the Dr. Prayer thing. I thought that was a fringe group, but now all of a sudden everyone.
Like I said, funnily enough, the anti-have faith heals believes in vaccines. So, But yeah, that's another one I'd be very clear about, is conspiracism is not on a political spectrum. The farther you get to the fringes, the more likely you are to find it. But it's not, and which conspiracies you believe can be politically motivated. But, there are just as many right-wing conspiracists. I don't know if that's 100% true anymore, but it used to be, at least, that there were just as many right-wing and left-wing conspiracists. Which conspiracies they believed, that's going to be a big difference. And, I'd like to point out that even some of the things that might have been thought of as conspiracy theories, we have evidence, Tuskegee syphilis I mentioned earlier, or, what the CIA was getting up to in Central and South America, and, things like that. But the way you prove that it's not just a conspiracy theory is with the evidence. And if you can't, number one, say what would convince you that you're wrong, and number two, start bringing evidence that you're right, why should I listen to you? Why should I talk to you? It's again, to go back to the YECs, because that's, a common ground that we have is you ask, Ken Ham, what's going to convince him that evolution is real, and he will not have an answer, because his answer is nothing. Nothing would convince him. He believes the Bible, and he's never going to not.
Oh, you're talking about the that debate they had 10 years ago at this point?
Christ, yeah. But I mean, I was using him as an example, but you ask, standing for truth, what would convince you that evolution is real? And he'll give you an answer, but when you really dig, the answer is nothing will, because I believe what I believe, and I'm not going to change my mind. Whereas you ask anyone who argues the pro-evolution side, they can say, okay, well, if I saw this, and this, it would convince me that evolution is not real. But it still wouldn't convince me that young Earth creationism is real, because that's not the same argument. Like we always used to say, if you convinced me that moon footage was faked, you then, which to do that, there's a whole list of things you'd have to do. But, including show how it was faked, which you can't because the technology did not exist in 1969. But that one thing wouldn't prove that we'd never landed on the moon. All you can prove is this one thing, because the pile of evidence just keeps going. I as a hobby and for fun, I will sometimes think of a way to make a conspiracy theory make sense. Like JFK. I've read the Warren Report, and I've looked over the evidence, and kids, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But let's say he didn't.
So the conspiracy is there's that grassy knoll person thing?
Grassy knoll is one of the options. There are more beliefs about JFK than than most people realize. And most of them are physically impossible. There was a TV show used to be on Discovery about 20 odd years ago now called Unsolved History, and they once tried to see if they could fit shooters in all of the places that people claimed that there had been other gunmen, and see if they could get a bead on where Kennedy would have been. And one of them was a storm drain that literally did not exist in 1963. So, that's fine. Not sure they convinced anyone that one was wrong either. But, if you want to come up with a conspiracy and say that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone, okay, I can make that make sense. You say either he was in the pay of somebody.
Like they thought. I heard that some people thought the guy who killed him was trying to shut him up or something.
Yeah, Jack Ruby was trying to shut him up is a fairly popular claim. So that's one of your options. Or here's my favorite: Lee was telling the truth. Lee said that he was in the lunchroom when the shooting happened. He didn't care about seeing the president. The man was a known communist. He was a former defector to the Soviet Union. He no interest in seeing the president, blah, 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 politics, blah, blah, blah. He was in the lunchroom. Okay, you want to make a conspiracy? Lee was in the lunchroom and somebody else was in the sniper's nest, which is the only theory that actually works for where a shooter was based on forensics and stuff. So you say that somebody else was in that window, and then they vanished, and because Lee worked there, all the suspicion went to Lee, and Lee did kill Officer Tippit later that day. We have something like 8 eyewitnesses who saw him do it. The evidence on that one's pretty incontrovertible, and yet, for whatever reason, he killed Tippit and everything else happened, blah, blah, blah. But that's never the argument these conspiracists make. And there are a couple of conspiracies that I can't make sense. I can't make them work with all the maneuvering along those lines that you want to do. 9/11 truthing is another one. You just have the CIA or whoever pay the hijackers. And everything else happened the way it actually did. And that's, it wasn't Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. It was the CIA or, whoever you want to be involved in that. And the buildings fell because physics and all of that. But that's never the argument. And even doing things like that, I cannot make faking the moon landing possible. That is just not possible. Not in 1969, not today. The technology is not there. And I cannot make Obama birtherism work because of the birth announcement published in the Honolulu newspaper the day after he was born. Everything else you can fake. That birth announcement, I don't know how or why you would be able to get that in the papers, unless he was actually born in Honolulu. So, it's not that I don't think about these things from the other perspective. It's that in order to do so, you have to say, well, okay, but this thing you're saying still doesn't make sense. So what if we do this other thing? I've thought about all kinds of weird conspiracy theories. To go back to another really non-controversial one, doesn't affect anybody's day-to-day life in any way, is what's called anti-Stratfordianism, which is the belief that Shakespeare did not write the plays of Shakespeare. That doesn't change anybody's life in any way. Whether it's true or not, literally does not matter at this point in time.
How's that conspiracy theory? Isn't that like people believing that Moses actually wrote the Bible?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, here's the evidence that isn't true. Well, I don't care. My favorite observation about Shakespeare was Mark Twain was not an anti-Stratfordian, but he wanted to be. He really didn't like what he knew of Shakespeare as a person. And to be fair, we don't know a lot about Shakespeare as a person. We just happen to know more than we do about a lot of other people from his era. But, Mark Twain wanted to be an anti-Stratfordian, and one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes is something along the lines of, well, it must have been the Glover's son after all, because the evidence just wasn't there. And I don't care. Go. I don't claim to have all of the answers to these things, but, it's... My belief that there are commonalities among all of these conspiracies is based on reading I've done over the years and 20 plus years of interacting with people in these circles. I have interacted with hoax believers. I've interacted with 9/11 truthers. I've interacted with young Earth creationists, flat earthers, QAnon, God help us. And the commonality there is these people do not want to be wrong. Whether it's because they like thinking that the world makes sense.
Or their hatred won't let them.
Yeah. There's a saying that the problem with who killed Kennedy is that the scales don't balance. You get this enormous, serious, world-changing event on one hand, and on the other side of the scale, you get Lee Harvey Oswald, a nobody. A guy who basically washed out of the Marines. He was an expert marksman and all that stuff, but he left the Marine. I believe he got a compassionate discharge because his mother was having a moment, and she was nuts. Crazy mother. He thought he was going to be treated to a hero's welcome in the Soviet Union when he defected, and he was given a job building radios in a factory.
Well, was it really all the four people that shot the presidents? Like, I forget the two of them are. I forget who shot Garfield and McKinley, but like Booth thought he get a hero's welcome in the South.
Yeah. Guteau, who killed Garfield, thought he was Guteau was, again, I'm not a doctor, but Guteau was almost certainly a paranoid schizophrenic. If you read what he believed, that man was not well. It wasn't about politics. He said it was about politics, but he also believed he was speaking to a ghost who was telling him to do these things. And, he believed that one speech he had made was why Garfield got to be president and therefore he should be ambassador to France. And I read a joint biography of Guteau and Garfield years ago and came away with the firm, unshakable belief that in this day and age he would have ended up in a mental hospital. I'm not saying I would prefer to be in a 19th century mental hospital than executed, because I'm not sure I would. But even in, 1881, there were people saying, this guy is not well. There's something wrong with this man.
Well, doctors were not the stuffy ways, because it wasn't the gunshot that killed Garfield. It was the doctors, really.
Oh yeah, no. The guy who took charge of Garfield's bedside, first off, didn't believe in germ theory, so that's a problem. Second, was utterly convinced he knew where the bullet was and was wrong. So he wouldn't let anyone look except in the place where he said the bullet was.
Yeah, I heard the bullet would have been less dangerous if they'd left it in there.
It would have. If they had left the bullet alone and just, sewed him up, it's almost certain that Garfield would have lived. And the course of history would have been, from what I know of Garfield, fairly different. But, Guteau actually used that as an argument in his trial. He was like, I didn't kill him, the doctors did. And that's true, but also there's a thing in law called proximate cause, and that's all on you, sir.
Like people who hire a assassin is as guilty or more guilty than the assassin itself.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you still shot him. The doctors couldn't have killed him if you hadn't shot him. And by the end, Garfield was glad to die because at least it meant he was out of the hands of the doctors. There's not a lot of Guteau didn't kill Garfield. I suspect because most people have no idea who Guteau was. And that's another thing, is very seldom are these beliefs about anything that isn't big. People are...
Yeah, how does something grow from a small thing to a small conspiracy to like a worldwide everyone?
Yeah.
Thing?
It's a lot of these stories have a they in them. And in part that is because a lot of these people want to believe that there is someone who controls things. It would make their life make more sense if they were shaping things.
Like the Jews caused the Black Plague type of thing.
Yeah. There's a series that I watched when I was a kid. There's only like a half a dozen episodes of it, but it's this show called Timeline. It's on YouTube. It's a PBS show that's a series of news broadcasts from different eras in history. And one of them is the second outbreak of the plague in like 1350-ish. I don't remember the exact year. 1349, something like that. Not the one that everyone thinks of first, but there was another outbreak a few years after that. And one of the characters talks about how, in the first outbreak of plague, people blamed it on the Jews. And she said, and I don't know if this is historically accurate because it's not my era, but she says that there's a lot less of that this time because everybody remembers that the Jews died too. You know, it's hard to blame the Jews for the plague when the Jews are dying of the plague just like you are. But I'm sure there were still people who believed that simply because it was someone to blame. There's something very comforting to conspiracists. You know, the reason this happened is because of this group or because of this reason. There's always a because. And like, you can't say, okay, well, here's the 15 causes that led up to this, plus the 13 things that are why this person was in this place at this time. Like, if you look at the beginning of World War I, so many things had to happen in exactly the right way to lead to one person getting shot.
And even after that, the way between being shot and the war actually starting was like a month or two gap that could have been evolved too.
Yeah, like you had to have this whole series of alliances, and you had to have this one person be in this specific position where he mattered which arguably he didn't, because he couldn't have taken the throne anyway, but that's a whole other conversation. And, you know, they had planned like 3 or 4 other possible assassinations on that same day, and they had all failed, and the guy just went to have a freaking sandwich, and then the driver got lost. You know, the assassin of Archduke Ferdinand was just having a sandwich because he'd given up on his assassination plans for the day, and then the car drove past him. Like, the world just works like that sometimes, and conspiracism does not allow for coincidence. Nothing ever just happens. You know, we'll get asked, when I was still doing this, we would get asked a lot, well, why did this happen this way? We're like, I don't know, because that's how it happened. Like, well, why didn't blah, blah, blah? Because sometimes, you know, when Big Bird found out that people die, the only answer they could give him is just because. And unfortunately, that's a basic truth of the world.
You mentioned that. That was the first episode of Sesame Street I ever remember watching. It was
wow!
I might have watched it earlier, but that's one. Mr. Hooper dying. I remember watching.
I mean, that's a memorable episode. But yeah, the just because is an answer that people don't like.
Sorry, very fast. And off topic. Well, same topic is the last one I remember watching was when everyone found out Mr. Snuffy was a real person.
Oh yeah. Which you know why they had the adults find out that Snuffy was real, right?
Why?
So that kids would think that adults would believe them when they wanted to tell adults serious things. And this is tangentially tied into yet another conspiracy, Satanic Panic, and the whole McMartin preschool thing, which, whoa, that's a rabbit hole. I met the judge from that case once. He judged my junior high mock trials team once, or my high school mock trials team once. But the belief that kids needed to know adults would believe them if they told adults serious things is why the adults learned that Snuffy was real. Because this is one that a lot of people don't remember, is it wasn't that Snuffy wasn't real. Snuffy was always real.
He always disappeared when people came around.
Well, he just wasn't there. It's not like he became invisible or something. It's Snuffy would wander off to go do Snuffy things, and the adults would come in. They would always just miss each other. It was a joke. And they changed that so that kids would feel like they were being believed. You know, it's a real world influence. But you look at Satanic Panic, and McMartin in particular, the woman who brought the initial charges was an alcoholic schizophrenic. But people believed her, and that created this whole crazy, chain of events And some of the conspiracy theories start from really simple, like somebody says something phrased wrong and people take that to mean that really, you know, like one of the early reports about what gun they found in the sniper's nest in Dallas, somebody said it was the wrong type of gun. And so there's this whole conspiracy theory about how, you know, they're hiding the real gun, and what that does, I don't know. I'm not a gun person. But, and it's just the information was reported badly. A lot of 9/11 truth stuff comes from, well, they said this and then they said that. It's like, you don't remember how things were going that morning, do you? Nobody knew what was going on, you know, and they couldn't not talk about it because the building done came down. But, you know, they get this news and they had to decide, well, do we tell people or do we hold off on it and then get scooped? And there's only so much that matters today, but, you know, they're used to a certain kind of journalistic mindset. And it's this whole mess of conflicting reporting and wrong information because people had just legitimately made mistakes and all sorts of stuff like that. And conspiracists seize on every single little, this isn't what so-and-so said, to claim that, for example, the plane didn't crash in Pennsylvania. It got rooted somewhere else, and the people got taken off the plane into a warehouse, and I think it was Cleveland? I don't remember. And presumably all those people, well, not all of them, because it's been, 20 plus years, but all those people are still alive and have just somehow never contacted their families. And that makes more sense than somebody said the wrong thing on the TV.
Which brings me to another conspiracy theory that's recently gained bankrupt because of it, the Alex Jones Sandy Hook thing.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah. And I've dealt with some of those people too. And, are you saying Alex Jones would just lie? Yes! Yes, I am! Some of the people who are preaching these things to you are lying and know they're lying. And you would rather believe that they're telling you the truth, like freaking Andrew Wakefield. Andrew Wakefield is a con man and a liar, alleged, but they'd rather believe Andrew Wakefield than the entire rest of the medical establishment. Are you saying that Andrew Wakefield's study could be faulty? Yes! That one doesn't even need an alleged. That's just true. And it's this who you believe, and once you believe that person, you're not going to believe anyone else. I'm like, okay, so I'm not going to believe, Raw Matt anytime soon, because Raw Matt has consistently shown that he doesn't know anything. I have yet to find anything that man knows about. He doesn't even know you need to eat food. But on the other hand, yeah, you show me new evidence. You show me evidence that somebody else was on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and I'll believe that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't. But until you have that evidence, I'm not going to believe that they stole the body and surgically altered Kennedy's brain.
What's that conspiracy theory? And people thought that everything happened on, was it April 19th, April 20th? All that stuff happened on those
dates? Lot of stuff has happened on April 20th, but, statistically, a lot of stuff has happened on every day.
True.
One of the things I do for my Facebook friends every day is every day a Facebook friend has a birthday. I go to the Internet Movie Database, and they have what I call the big list of birthdays, which is everybody who has an IMDb page who has a birthday on that day. Yeah. And I say, hey, you share a birthday with so-and-so. And it turns out every single day has at least a handful. Some of them, weirdly, have fewer than others. But there is no day where the big list of birthdays is blank. or even has fewer than like 1,000 people on it, because there's a lot of IMDb pages. And there's never a day when there's not people I've heard of on the list.
Yeah, I think I might be getting the dates wrong, but like didn't like both Columbine and Oklahoma happen on April the same day?
April 20th. April 20th, which is also a certain German leader's birthday. Whether that's coincidental or not, I don't actually know. Knowing what I do about some of those people, it's possible. But I don't know if it's actually true or not. Like, actually intended or not. You know, and a lot of people, their conspiracy theories, again, are politically motivated. You know, the QAnon people are fairly obvious, but, you know, 9/11, it was curious. The 9/11 truther movement is fascinating because it is both a hardcore right-wing and a hardcore left-wing movement, but who they believe was really responsible is the big divider. Left-wing, it's always the CIA. If you want to know who hardcore left-wing people believe did something, it's the CIA. Despite the running joke that the reason we know that the CIA didn't have Kennedy killed is that he's dead. And yeah, there probably always will be conspiracy theorists because some of the mindset is hardwired into the human mind. We are, and this is one I got from Jay, we are a pattern-recognizing species to the point that there is an actual scientific word for seeing patterns in things where there are no patterns.
So
that's such a human thing.
So where do you draw the line between someone who's a skeptic doubter and a full-blown conspiracy theorist? Or is there
evidence?
Okay.
Can you answer the question, this is what would make me change my mind? If you can't answer the question, or if your standard of evidence is impossible to meet, where there should be a possible standard of evidence, you are now a conspiracist. Like, if the only thing that would convince you that we landed on the moon is going yourself personally to the Apollo landing sites and seeing what's left there, you are a conspiracist. You may not like the term, but that's what you are. If nothing would change your mind, oh boy, you're a conspiracist. If there's always a reason to reject the evidence. We'll call this one the wheat. This is not on Jackson. This is actual literal wheat. The wheat defense. So, an obvious question that may come to mind when it comes to a theoretical hoax moon landing is, if it's possible for some random dude with no education to know that the moon landing was faked, why didn't the Soviet Union say, hey, they faked a moon landing? This is an obvious question, right? So the answer is we bribed them with wheat. And this part is true. In the 70s, the United States sent shipments of wheat to the Soviet Union. I don't know a ton about it, but I knew that it had happened before I got into conspiracy debunking. So that's actually a thing that happened. And they paid, but there's, you know, I don't know a ton of the details on this because honestly, I don't care that much. But conspiracists will always tell you, if you ask them that question, either they don't know or Cold War was faked, guy. This is how we found out that he thought the Cold War was fake. Or we bribed them with wheat. Does that make sense? No. How little sense does that make? I'm glad you asked. Do you know when we sent these shipments of wheat to the Soviet Union? in the Ford administration.
So
Gerald Ford took office in August of 1974.
So the mid 70s. Let's say the late 70s. That's Carter. So
Carter was elected president in 1976, about a month before I was born, and took office about 6 weeks after I was born. So very, very technically, I was born in the Ford administration, but only by a hair. Yeah. My older sister had a friend who was born the day Nixon resigned. So, yeah, 74. Doug Kearney's birthday, whatever that was. But the thing you may notice about 1974 is that it's a bit after we stopped sending Apollo missions. So somehow we had an entire presidential election and half an administration. Yeah, we had about 5 years between when we claimed to have landed on the moon and when this wheat got sent. And somehow in that entire time, the Soviet Union didn't blow the whistle. So that's not an answer that makes any sense.
Oh, back to the original topic. We talked about earlier the moon thing. That's another thing people bring up. It says, if we came if we were the moon in the 70s, how come we're not still there now?
Money. Now? Yeah, and the answer is money. And I've gotten a lot of pushback to that answer, but that is what the answer is. The money has to be there. People can talk about it all they want to. The technology is certainly, we could, not tomorrow, but we could start a program today that would send people to the moon probably within 5 years if we were willing to pay for it. And we're not. And that is why we have not gone back. Money. Nixon couldn't kill Apollo before the moon landing. That would have been a bad look.
Yeah, I heard another reason is because it was the Cold War caused it, because we were trying to get there first, and now we don't have any competition to get.
And don't trust Elon Musk to get us there is all I can say. But Nixon hated Apollo because Kennedy had announced it and Johnson had really pushed it. And so Nixon hated it because Nixon, weird, complicated guy. So he killed it as soon as he could.
So the other party liked it?
No. Kennedy and Johnson personally. It wasn't just, it wasn't just the Democrats. Partially it was the Democrats. Mostly it was his personal antagonism for reasons that make sense if you know their personal history and McCarthyism and a whole bunch of things along those lines. But it was because it was Kennedy and it was because it was Johnson that he killed it. And then we got into Space Lab, which did some neat experiments, but not really very much else. And then somebody told somebody on the space shuttle. We had that for a really long time. And now we just basically don't have anything because the political will isn't there.
Well,
and that's why we haven't gone back.
Did you hear about how I saw this on the History Channel thing about how Big Bird was almost on the Space Challenger?
There was talk about it. And speaking as somebody who's read a decent amount about the Muppets, it never would have happened. The logistics of getting Carol Spinney in the Big Bird suit into space were not there.
But can you imagine it was? And the kids were already upset about the first place. Imagine if a major character died.
Oh, yeah, no, and Krista McAuliffe's class was watching on TV live and got to see their teacher die. So that was traumatizing enough. One of Zane's godparents, their father is a retired teacher, and I believe he was a finalist.
I can't remember if I watched or not, because if it happened, I forget. I was in the AM kindergarten, so I might have been home when it happened, or I might have been in school. I forget.
I was in third grade. I was in third grade. And the woman who had been the student aide in my second grade class saw me walking. It's not really a hall, it's outside because Altadena, whatever. But she saw me walking towards the office, I think. Certainly I know where I was, I just don't remember why I was there. And she made sure she told me because she knew I would be interested. So that's how I found out about it.
Yeah, I don't remember if I was watching it or not, because I don't remember if I was in school or not that day.
Yeah.
Because like I said, AM, PM stuff, it was...
Yeah,
weird.
well, and I wouldn't have been watching because I think it was 8 o'clock in the morning Florida time, which would have put it at like 5 o'clock in the morning my time. So I definitely was not watching. Yeah. Time zones. How do they even work?
Hey, is this a conspiracy theory right here?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, there are tons. There are tons, and there have been for well over a century. I mean, very, very famously, there's Anna Anderson. Anna Anderson, as she came to be known, what was her real name? Hold on a second. So the Google helpfully suggests imposter. Yes. So the communists did not announce that they had killed the entire family. Franziska Szankowska was her real name. What's the relative age there? Who was 5 years older than the real Anastasia, for the curious, because I just looked that up. I believe they announced that they had executed the Tsar, but they didn't announce anything about the family. The family just disappeared. And so there were so many theories. And there are actually quite a lot of imposters of various notoriety. And this woman threw herself off a bridge in Paris, I must say? No, Berlin. She attempted to kill herself by jumping off the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin. And she was taken to a mental hospital where she refused to identify herself. She had no papers. She was admitted as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown, to a mental hospital. She stayed there for 2 years. She spoke German with an accent that the staff described as Russian, but was Polish. And eventually there was a claim that she was Anastasia. Some people said she was. Some of the family said she was. Some of the family said she wasn't. Whispers back and forth, the whole 9 yards. And she claimed to the end of her life that she was really the Grand Duchess Anastasia. She married an American who was delighted to consider himself to be the husband of Anastasia. And DNA evidence has since shown that she was, in fact, a random Polish woman. So, yeah. There's a really good Caitlin Doty video about what happened to the Romanovs. They found the bodies in the 90s, late 80s, or before the fall of the Soviet Union. They found the bodies, but they hid them again because it was not a good time. But the Russian Orthodox Church, but the Russian Orthodox Church still doesn't accept that we have the bodies. And apparently Putin doesn't want to admit that we have the bodies. Apparently, guess who they blame? You'll never guess who Putin blames for what happened to the Romanovs.
The Jews?
The Jews. Because Yeah. No, they found them, but they found the other two in a different place. So they do have all of... Seriously, ask a mortician, Caitlin Doty, what happened to the Romanov bodies. It's a fascinating video. She does a really terrible Russian accent in it. I cannot recommend it highly enough.
Here's my conspiracy theory. The reason that people want to believe that those are the bodies, that proves that Russian people in charge can be killed.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you name any historical event of note, there was within 5 to 10 years of its existence, there was a conspiracy theory about it. A lot of, the Jews are the Americans only because it was the Soviets, but yeah. But no, Putin says it was the Jews, which it wasn't. It wasn't the Jews. It was the communists. Yeah. Caitlin Doty asks to not be Kremlin-botted about it, but I figure you can use the traffic. So she gets a lot more traffic than you do. But which is not intended as an insult. She's a fairly big name. Some of the conspiracy, basically either there is still a conspiracy theory that somebody believes, or else nobody really remembers the thing. My own historical era that I have studied the most is the Elizabethan era. And obviously the conspiracy from that era that everyone thinks about is anti-Stratfordianism. And boy, howdy, are a lot of those stupid. Let me just interject. If you are making up somebody who wrote Shakespeare's plays, it would help if they didn't die a literal quarter century before he stopped writing plays. I'm just going to throw that out there. But, the other one, if I could have the answer to any historical puzzle, it would be what happened to Amy Dudley? And I almost phrased it as who killed her, which is fun because we don't actually know if she was murdered or not. Her husband was the favorite of Queen Elizabeth. They had been childhood friends. If she would have married anybody, the historical evidence is that she most wanted to marry this guy. But he was already married by the time she took the throne. Political machinations under her brother's reign. Doesn't matter. One day, she was all alone in the house. When the servants came home, she was on the floor, dead. What happened? We don't know. There was an autopsy, but it was a 16th century autopsy, so a lot of good. Oh yeah, that's a fun one. The Middle Ages didn't exist. Yeah. Roman Empire didn't exist either. This woman on TikTok said. Did she die of natural causes? Did she slip and fall? Was she murdered? Did she throw herself down the stairs? We don't know. We'll never know. If I could have the answer to one historical mystery, it would be to know what happened to Amy Dudley. But 400 years on, there's still conspiracy theories because we don't know and we hate not knowing.
Was it Elizabeth's? Great. Elizabeth's great uncles, the two boys in the tower thing.
Oh yeah, no.
I think they were her great uncles or
no, they're a couple generations before that. So
see, it was her grandmother's brothers.
Her
grandmother's brothers.
Oh gosh, it was, wasn't it? Yeah, no, because
Edward New York was Henry VIII's mother.
Edward the Something died, and his brother Richard said that he had proof that the boys were illegitimate and hid them away in the tower and took the throne, and the boys were never seen or heard from again. He died at Bosworth Field. We found his body. He had adolescent onset scoliosis and actually was a hunchback. And I can say that because I have adolescent onset scoliosis and I'm a hunchback. And Henry VII married the boy's sister to cement his claim to the throne, which he only had by conquest. I will die on this hill, and so did Richard. And the boys were still never heard from. They found skeletons that might have been the boys, but we don't know. And yeah, so that is Elizabeth's great uncles, the princes in the tower. Man, genealogy, it's weird. Everybody's related to everybody.
Yeah, but yeah, there's a thing that he killed them or somebody else killed them, or
yeah. Did Richard kill them? I'm personally, this may be a conspiracy theory on my part. I think that Henry VII had it done. I think it makes more sense from an examination of the evidence. But I will also admit that my knowledge of that era of Elizabethan of English history is kind of scanty and doesn't really get good for another like 30 years.
Because in order to marry Elizabeth, he had to make their births legal again. Not illegitimate, because otherwise his marriage wouldn't count.
If the boys were illegitimate, then so was their sister. And so she didn't have a claim to the throne, but if the boys were legitimate, they had a better claim than he did. Yeah. So it's all medieval politics, man. It's a lot. It's a lot. You know, and I'm curious about that one. I pity Amy Dudley is kind of why I want to know with her. Because it is sad that she died alone and nobody knows why and nobody, you know, ever will. And I mean, there were pretenders to the boys for decades after, and, you know, going back to Russian history, there were Russian pretenders. History Tea Time, I think, did a video the other day on curses on the Romanov family that includes one of the major Russian pretenders. And I mean, that arguably pretenders are the monarchist equivalent of QAnon and election deniers.
Is that like Catherine the Great's horse sex thing?
Oh man, which is not true. She had a stroke. She died either, depending on who you ask, she died at her desk or on the toilet, but she did not get crushed by a horse. She was a voracious woman, but there's no evidence there were farm animals involved. But yeah, that's another conspiracy theory, the whole how Catherine the Great died.
I don't know if it's a conspiracy or not, but from what I read of history, like, was the next kid actually the Tsar's kid because the Tsar didn't like sleeping with her or something?
Almost certainly not. He was almost certainly incapable. So it is almost certainly the case that the Romanov line really ended when Catherine was involved in the murder of her husband. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just a historical fact. You know, there are some monarchs that are involved where it's like, well, maybe they were involved in it. Maybe they were, you know, did Mary Queen of Scots have her second husband killed? Was she involved? We don't know. Catherine the Great, yeah, no, she had her husband.
You really can't tell who the father is, but you can tell who the mother is.
Yeah. Which is why so much of human history is involved trying to keep women away from men, because that way you'll know who the father of kids are, instead of doing it the sensible way and having it a matrilineal descent. But yeah. No, it is a generally acknowledged historical fact that Catherine the Great's son was not the Tsar's son, and that he could not. But then there was speculation that Marie Antoinette's children were not Louis the whatever's kids, and that's probably not true. They probably were his kids.
Like, I think they did the same thing with James II's son when because he was a Catholic, and like no, they said his son died so they can have her daughter,
Yeah.
his daughter on the throne.
Yeah. There's a period Elizabethan, well, Tudor, because it's before she took the throne mostly, conspiracy theory that Elizabeth wasn't Henry's daughter, which she was. She really, really was. But there was a belief that, since her mother had been executed for adultery and that's possible vagary. The Clan of the Cave Bear books actually end with Ayla inventing the patriarchy, which I find enormously funny. But it's the belief that because men are responsible for half of producing children, and because you can't be as sure who the father of a child is, ergo patriarchy, so that men can know who their children are. It's a whole thing. Those books are hysterically funny. But I do think that conspiracism is partially just we're a pattern recognizing species. And Jay Windley always said that the problem is if you are, Homo sapiens living in Africa tens of thousands of years ago, and you hear a rustling in the bush. He says tiger, so we're going to move this to Asia because that's where tigers live. If you're in Asia tens of thousands of years ago, you hear a rustling in the bush, and you think it's a tiger, and it turns out to be a bunny, well, haha, that's who you were scared for no reason. Whereas if you think it's a bunny and it turns out to be a tiger, you are dead. So we get really, really good at seeing the tiger, whether it's there or not. And the problem is,
I can always believe in the worst thing, possibility thing, type of thing.
Well, because if it's a tiger, we need to see the tiger whether it's there or not. And tigers are really good at hiding. So that's why we see pictures in clouds. That's why, there's actually there's a kind of marble that part of the Washington State Capitol building is faced inside that's called picture marble. And it's because the design makes it look like you see pictures in it. Moss agate is a stone that's called that because the patterns look like moss. They're not moss. We know they're not moss, but they kind of look like moss. Or freaking Roger and his whole, this cave is really a fossilized lady part. All of that kind of thing. And it's where conspiracy theories come from. We're looking for a pattern. And there's nothing wrong with, well, I think such and such means, I've got some headcanon. I'm not going to, some real world headcanon even. I'm not going to claim to be above that because it's a human condition. It becomes a problem when you can't say, oh, haha, I was wrong, that's not a tiger. When you can't see the evidence that your pattern is wrong, that's when it's a problem, and that's when it steps into conspiracism. Oh, they agree. Everyone's related to everyone. It's fascinating. I love it. The kids turn out to be, through their dad, fourth cousins 6 times removed or something ridiculous like that from Harry Truman. Yeah, well, this is the Washington State Capitol here in Olympia, so nonsense. The Habsburgs are only related to other Habsburgs, hence the chin. Sorry, that's a little historian joke. And I'm sure there was a certain, when they still could, there was a certain amount of outbreeding, just not in the royal line. Yeah, we need to know. And in some ways, that's been great for us. We were able to land on the moon because it was so important to us to know. The moon is there. There has to be a way of getting to it.
We had to do it for the Soviets.
Yeah, well, that. But I mean, if you look at it, the history of science fiction trips to the moon goes back literally centuries. You know who wrote a science fiction story about going to the moon? Cyrano de Bergerac, who is a real historical person. The nose thing was exaggerated.
I think I say Jules Verne.
Even before. Jules Verne, yes, but Cyrano de Bergerac. And his is more fanciful.
I did not know that.
There's a Steve Martin movie called Roxanne, which is based on Cyrano de Bergerac. And there's a scene where he tells this story about aliens. And it is very, very loosely based on the historical Cyrano de Bergerac's stories about going to the moon. I watched that movie again recently. That's a fun movie. And we also like believing that we're right. And there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to believe you're right. What's wrong?
Yeah, it's just when will do anything to prove you're right type of thing.
Yeah. You have to be able to say, okay, well, I believe this, but the evidence says this other thing. Yeah. And again, 1500s, and that is one of the first known science fiction stories. That's getting far enough back that it's really hard to define science fiction because science was kind of not entirely a thing yet in the 1500s. The answer to what would convince me I'm wrong is something you should think about with everything you believe. Everything. And that's hard to do. We as humans are not great at that. And I'm sure I've got some things that I believe that I have not yet stopped and said, okay, well, what would convince me that I'm wrong? And that doesn't mean you have, your brain. I think this is another J one, is your mind should be open, but not so open that it falls out. But if you can't say, okay, I believe thing, but maybe I'm wrong about thing, and this is what would show me that I'm wrong, that's the belief you have to examine most. And yeah, some things do have kind of an impossible standard. What would convince me that vaccines secretly kill people? A whole lot more dead people, frankly. They're just that one is as disproven as it is possible for something to be. Yes, pliable but not slim. Or slime, yes. Either one, really. So, what would convince me that the moon landings was faked? Explaining how they did it. If you cannot explain how the moon landings were faked, then the burden of proof is not met. The burden of proof is on the person who says documented history is wrong. And you know what? Burdens of proof like that get met all the time. For decades at least, there was a belief that ulcers were caused by stress. Everybody knew that. And you avoid stress and you're careful of your diet. Yeah, COVID doesn't kill people, so what caused the spike in all-cause mortality? Right, exactly. Before the vaccine, because people will claim it was the vaccine, even though non-vaccinated people, you know what? Yeah, we all know. But you have to be able to explain. So these guys, they said, and they won a Nobel Prize for it. They said, well, we don't think ulcers are caused by stress. We think they're caused by bacteria. And the way they chose to prove that was a lot, because they drank the bacteria that they believed caused ulcers. And you know what happened? They got ulcers. And they took antibiotics, and the ulcers went away.
Yeah, I think I heard something about that. Like, it was ulcers or heartburn or like spicy stuff. They thought spicy stuff caused heartburn, but it was like bacteria or virus or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's ulcers. They believed that ulcers were, caused by bacteria, and they proved it. It was believed that women having a lot of heartburn proves that their babies have a lot of hair, was an old wives' tale. And then they did studies, and it turns out that one's actually true, which explains why I had so much heartburn when I was pregnant with Sandy, because she was born with a ton of hair. So what you do is you go and you look for the evidence. Here's one. I wouldn't qualify it as a conspiracy theory, but it is, we'll call it a folk belief. The belief that crime and lunacy, so to speak, and things like that happen more often at the full moon. Everybody believes that. And then you do studies, and it turns out it's not true. Crime doesn't spike, hospital admissions don't spike, psych admissions don't spike. Humans are not that connected to the moon. Yeah, Göbekli Tepe, which there's still some debate about whether we just haven't found the evidence of agriculture or not, or maybe there was a city before there was agriculture. But we made this discovery, and now we're rewriting the history books. The joke on the Bad Astronomy Board back in the day used to be that you prove science wrong and you win the free trip to Sweden. And it's free trip to Sweden season right now, too. Because what that meant was, if you can overturn science, admittedly, this is only a handful, but since, physics was one of them, that was a physics board, you win the Nobel Prize. You overturn science, you get all of this. And conspiracists and young earth creationists and people along those lines aren't going through the work. They aren't providing the evidence, and they're making stuff up. I cannot tell you the number of things where I said, no, but that isn't true. Like, here is document. I once was dealing with an anti-vaxxer who insisted that the reason we have eliminated smallpox was increased sanitation. And that really we had eliminated this whole wide list of diseases, but people only talked about smallpox. And that's not true. And I went through and I found enormous numbers of, I went through, something conspiracists don't get is you don't get famous in academia by confirming the known. Absolutely right. Absolutely. Which is its own problem, because it means nobody wants to do the work to confirm the studies. But, rather than hiding a cure for cancer, cure cancer and get the trip to Sweden.
I think if one of the, I think if we mentioned it, they said if a creationist could actually confirm that evolution was false, they'd get a Nobel Prize themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could prove, and in one of the Science of Discworld books, they're talking about how one of them was listening to a radio show in the Bible Belt, and somebody was demanding to know why Darwin didn't win a Nobel Prize if evolution was true. And the answer is because Nobel Prizes didn't exist yet. Which is a really simple answer. Because Nobel Prizes didn't exist yet. And it does not take a lot of research to find that answer. But if if one of the Matts or Bad Jackson or any of those people could actually provide the evidence that evolution is false, I believe, not sure which Nobel, but I believe there's a Nobel that they would qualify for. And certainly there's lots of other awards that they would get if they could actually prove. Yeah, if you could cure cancer, you would be so, and you can't cure cancer because cancer is not one disease, but for the purposes of conspiracists thinking, no, it's not. This is the other thing, is oversimplification is a big thing in conspiracy circles. But if you could cure cancer, you would be so rich. And to put it in even simpler terms, cancer researchers often go into the field because somebody they loved got cancer. My best friend's other best friend died like 2 weeks ago at the age of 37 years old of metastatic breast cancer. Do you think if she knew a cancer researcher, that person would have let her die? But friends and family of cancer researchers die of cancer all the time. So if you're going to say they have the cure for cancer and just aren't sharing it, that's one I want an answer for. Why do friends and family of cancer researchers, the children of cancer researchers, die of cancer? On top of the Nobel Prize, on top of the fame and glory. You can't even save your friends and family? They cannot pay you enough to make up for what you'd get if you had a cure. Like, I would actually tell people when they were saying, oh, you're just lying, you're a NASA shill, blah, blah, blah. Like, look, NASA can't pay me enough. Not just because they don't have the budget, but because of my personal moral stance. I believe that, they can't save themselves. Cancer researchers die of cancer. But I believe that betrayal, covering up history, is a sin. That's part of my personal religious worldview. To cover up history is a sin. Nobody has the kind of money to make me do that.
Oh, so this is like the they can cure it, but they're hiding the cure, like more money type of thing.
They make more money on cures. Well, yeah, that's true. They make more money on treatment than they would on a cure. Yeah, you know what? That is true. That is absolutely true. They do. But that doesn't answer everything about why there is no cure, and the real answers make a lot more sense. Actually, fun fact, people who are no one who has gotten the HPV vaccine has gotten cervical cancer. The HPV vaccine has the possibility of wiping out cervical cancer. Get your shots, people. I'm too old. They won't give it to me anymore. But if you are young enough, so they will give you an HPV vaccine, get your shot. Zane is going to be old enough in about a year or two. He's getting his shot. Because we can wipe out an entire form of cancer.
Is that a recent thing? I don't remember it being right when I was Zane's age.
The HPV, I have always been too old, as long as they've had one. And they've expanded the age upward a couple of times, and I'm still too old to get the HPV vaccine. I think you have to be in your 30s. So if you are under whatever the age is, go get your shot.
So I just missed it then.
Yeah.
I don't think I guess it's me. You're too young for some, you're too old for other vaccines.
Yeah, no, like I said before, I'm not going to defend Big Pharma in every particular. The pharmaceutical industries have a lot to answer for. But most of the anti-pharmaceutical conspiracies themselves do not make sense. If we have a cure for cancer, but it's a vaccine, but you can get this vaccine that will keep you from getting this kind, if you're the right age, that will keep you from getting this kind of cancer. Like the leaps you have to go through in order to square this for yourself are too big. Conspiracies are a way of making the world seem simple that in reality make it a lot more complex.
I'm glad we're the right age for COVID. We're too old for HPV. We're too young for singles.
Yeah. Well, when the COVID vaccine first came out, Sandy was too young, and that was stressful. Yeah, people would pay a fortune for a vaccine that would guarantee, but you can get one fairly cheap that will keep you from getting cervical cancer. Michael Douglas is pretty sure his throat cancer comes from HPV, which is possibly true, but also more than I wanted to know about Michael Douglas. Because the HPV vaccine will cause cancer that is not just, in your private parts, but if you get the cancer from it in other places in your body, it's because of contact with people's private parts. So thanks, Michael Douglas. So if you are of an age, get the shot. Save lives. Possibly your own. Wouldn't that be nice? But the more you look into these conspiracies, the more you have to explain. And, Solid Solar Surface guy, who has been a joke in my circle of friends for literally decades at this point. We'll be somewhere like, God, it's hot. It's hotter than the surface of the sun, which, as we all know, is solid iron. The sheer number of things that had to be true for his view to make sense that aren't, that are flatly contradicted by enormous other piles of evidence, whereas the simple answer was he was reading a picture wrong. And the Kennedy stuff, it's like, well, I don't want to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, so instead I'm going to do this enormous other list of things. And so crazed. People will tell you that things are the way they are because they want it to be that way. And the real world is messy and complicated and doesn't look the way you want it to. Yeah, the world building on conspiracism is fascinating. I've always felt that some of the YACs would be so much better off if they would just write fiction. But instead they want to pretend that's what the world is really like. There's a website, I think it's still up, of like 100 things that are wrong in the Oliver Stone movie JFK, which, side note, I also just thought was really boring. But that's like a 2-hour and change movie with 100 plus things wrong in it. We want the world to make sense. Yeah. The world needs to be controlled by someone. Jackie Kennedy, after her husband was killed, said something along the lines of, it couldn't even be about civil rights. She wanted, if her husband had to be murdered, at least it could have been for something important. And it wasn't. Just a little nobody who always was a nobody, and the only reason he's not is that he succeeded in, one shot. Yeah. Well, I think it's because believing in conspiracy will ruin your ability to write decent fiction, because conspiracies don't have to hang properly. Exploding rebar and holographic planes, and you just throw it all in there, and somehow, Kubrick filmed the moon landing because sure, why not? Side note, we also know that Kubrick didn't do it because Kubrick never left England if he could help it, and no matter where they were going to send him to film the moon landing, it wasn't going to be in England, so it couldn't have been Kubrick.
Yeah. Oh, we talked about this at the very beginning of the video 2 hours ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I know some wild beliefs from hoax believers. I made a sampler for a friend of mine that I met through the Bad Astronomy Board back in the day, and it's Apollo themed, and one of the quotes on it is "You're a liar and a coward and a thoof." Bart Sibrel, because that's the hoax believer that Buzz Aldrin punched. Becca Giustiano, I mean, fiction has to be believable. Real life has no such restriction. Yeah, Mark Twain said something about that too, I think. And the other one that I put on there that was from a hoax believer was this was a guy who went by the name of Moon Man, and his complaint was that the ascent stage went up like a rocket. And we were like, well, yes. So I said back at the beginning that there was no correlation between intelligence and conspiracism one way or the other. That being said, I do know some delightfully stupid stories from conspiracists. Moon Man is also the guy who came up with the ever popular, exactly how far from the surface of the moon does this alleged vacuum start? Yes. Moon Man honestly would have gotten along fairly well with Rob Matt, from what I can tell, because he didn't know anything about anything either.
Yeah. Speaking of JFK and anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theories, do you think they would like support his nephew, who's now an anti-vaxxer?
Well, the entire rest of the family has basically disowned him at this point. The Kennedy family is complicated. There's a lot of history to the family. I think, based on what I know of JFK, who was quite a piece of work, we think he's great mostly because Johnson was really, really skilled at using his legacy to get what Johnson wanted done. Mm-hmm. But what I know of JFK strongly indicates to me that the anti-vax thing would have just infuriated him no end. Also, his father, RFK Sr., would have been furious about turning his back on minority populations to ally with the Republican Party. Won't say that would have been true of JFK, but by 1968, RFK was very, very solidly supportive. He was much more interested in civil rights. He's the one who went out of his way to align Jack with Martin Luther King. I have a lot more respect for RFK than I do for JFK, honestly. But I really think RFK Sr. would have been horrified had he known some of the direction his son would go in. Don't know as much about JFK. I think some of it would have made him really angry. I don't know if as much of it would have. Well, you have to also remember that Johnson, who is also an extremely complicated man, would go in front of Congress and say things like, we need to pass this legislation for our fallen leader. It wasn't something that JFK really cared all that much about, but Johnson did, and Johnson knew that it would get passed if he could hide behind the corpse of JFK and say that it was JFK who really wanted it. So, you know, JFK himself, not much of a hero, but Johnson sure liked pretending he was. despite not having particularly liked him personally and having really deeply loathed Bobby. 60s politics is weird.
Like, do you? I know it's off topic. Do you think if RFK hadn't been killed, he would have beaten Nixon in the election? I think was RFK going to win the primary. You think?
I think he would have had a much better chance. I think it would have been extremely close. But I do think that no Democrat other than Bobby had a real chance at beating Nixon. No, that's true. I have a lot of things to say about a lot of people who lived long, who died young, and turned out to have been really horrible people. I think it's at bare minimum possible that Bobby could have won.
More than whoever was the winner at the end. What was his? I forget his name.
Yeah, he won that day. That was the day of the California primaries was when he was killed. My mother actually, one of her coworkers at the time, was in the ballroom when it happened. Because, we're from LA, so he'd entered the race relatively late because he didn't enter the race until after Johnson dropped out, as I recall. And so he hadn't won all of the primaries because he hadn't been in some of the primaries, but he had won California, which then as now was kind of important. I think it's entirely possible. I think California would have been a much closer thing than it later became, not least because, Nixon was from California. He was born in Loma Linda. He went to Whittier College. He was governor for a while. He was a senator from California. He was a California boy. But I think it would have been tight, but I think Bobby theoretically could have done it. But I don't know if that would have been good for the Kennedy family to have had a second president. They already have more than their share of hubris. Oh, God. If the president does it, it's not a crime. Apparently, both Nixon and the current Supreme Court.
All right, so wrapping this up, this is, I guess, getting late for you, or is it early for you still? I forget.
It's still early for me. I'm further west than you are.
Can I say hi?
You can say hi, but then you need to go.
Hi.
Hi. So, if we're wrapping this up now, I think looks like your kids need attention.
No, it's my night off for parenting. She's supposed to be bothering.
But is there more you want to say about this, or do
Watching something.
you want to wrap this up in 10 minutes, give or take?
I think that it's easy to think that your perspective is fact and their perspective is conspiracism. And I think that that's something you need to be really careful of. And so anytime you find yourself arguing a belief, what you need to do is stop and say, okay, if I were arguing against me, what would convince me that I'm wrong? Because if you can't answer, if you can't answer that question, Vegri, then That's dipping into conspiracist thinking, and you need to really take a minute. That's how we get into things like Lost Cause mythology and young Earth creationism and all those other people we know who can't admit when they're wrong. And I would like to emphasize, I have never claimed to be a professional about any of these things. Well, eldritch squid monsters do have their privileges. I have never said that I'm a mental health professional. I'm not a scientist of any kind. This is all based on reading and personal experience. Your mileage may vary, but I did spend, arguably I am still in conspiracy debunking circles. I do have a lot of experience, and I do have a lot of friends who agree with a lot of my experiences, and I have read, more professional books. So, if you find yourself saying they are doing such and such, stop a minute, reflect. Who is they? If it's the Jews, you're already too far.
Or witches, or
Jews, witches, the gays. The gays are a popular scapegoat.
blacks.
Oh boy, blacks, yeah.
Oh, the gays.
The gays. Gay agenda, get up, go to brunch, clean house. You have to be careful of your own patterns of thought because you are not immune. I think a lot of us have kind of been vaccinated in as much as we've seen it in other people. And it gives us the perspective to say, oh, am I being like that person? Because I'm sure we can all fill in who that person is in our own personal lives. No, I wouldn't say. I would probably go with as much as 75% of conspiracies are gateways to it's the Jews. There's a lot that aren't. I'll say, I have yet to hear that the Jews faked the moon landing, at least. I do think I've heard that the Jews killed Kennedy. I'm pretty sure Cold War guy thought the Jews faked the Cold War, but I think he got banned before we ever got to that point. Most conspiracies about communists scratch the surface, and it's really about the Jews. So far as I know, no one says the Jews wrote the plays of Shakespeare. But the Jews did get FDR to allow the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor so that we could get into World War II, so he could, kill time for a few years and let millions of Jews die, which is not how I would have done things, but hey. Yeah, there's so many. Oh, I've definitely heard that the Jews did 9/11. That one is very common. Supposedly, and I heard this one in 2001 still. Supposedly, every Jew who worked at the World Trade Center got a message telling them to stay home from work that day. Which, is not true. But
I'm gonna use it since Dad's using that one.
so it's if you're blaming any one group for anything without thinking certain members of that group, no, it does not count if it's Jewish people joking about faking those. If it's Jewish people joking about the conspiracy, then that's different. Jewish people are allowed to make those jokes.
Yeah, I read, or I heard or read somewhere that. Did you ever watch that? You ever heard that show Hogan's Heroes?
Oh yes, I watched Hogan's Heroes as a child in
The
rerun.
two Nazi commanders of the camp were really Jewish people.
I'm pretty sure that one of them was. I don't remember about the other. But yeah, most of the pagans I know make jokes about the things that witches do. we're all really loving Agatha all along. Patty Lupone got a great tirade in the most recent episode about pop culture witches. But it's easy to find yourself slipping, especially if you're in a minority group. You know, as a pagan, I do get a certain amount of it's easy to assume that all Christians are a certain way, but they're not. As a woman, it's easy to assume that all men are a certain way, but they're not. But from the perspective of being outside that group, you have to understand why it's hard for us to, why we have to force ourselves to force ourselves to remember that you're not all like that. And it's up to you to prove to us.
Sorry.
It's up to you to prove that you're not one of the ones we need to be worried about, not for us to take it for granted that you might be one of the ones we don't have to worry about. But if you are punching down in your conspiracy, I have no sympathy for you. If you're a Christian blaming everything on atheists, if you're blaming everything on the Jews or the blacks or the gays or the trans or whatever, I don't have a lot of sympathy for that, because you're the one in power and you just want to feel like a victim. The Jews do not control the world economy. If that were true, there wouldn't be any poor Jews, and there are. Jon Stewart actually joked the other day about the idea that that the Jews are sending hurricanes into Florida because Jewish people retire to Florida.
Oh yeah, he said if we control the weather, we make it less humid.
Yes. It's like, that is probably true, John. And Jon Stewart can make that joke. I can just mention that he did, because I'm a goy who also speaks a bit of Yiddish. So just be aware of patterns of thought. Look at the evidence. Acknowledge that you can be wrong. That's the only tools I can really offer to people. Yeah. As a woman, I have to assume that all men are dangerous until I get to know them. As a non-Christian, I have to assume all Christians are out to convert me until they prove otherwise. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And my male friends and my Christian friends are, generally speaking, aware of that fact. Annoying and exhausting and a survival strategy, yes. And as a member of the in-group, you have to prove that you're not that person. It's not up to the members of the out-group to make you feel better about yourself. It's up to you to make them feel better. So, and it is also true that it is far more likely to be the case that the conspiracy will attack those who are members of the out group. The two we've talked about that are a really big thing in that department are Tuskegee syphilis and the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is yet another way of blaming the Jews.
What
Gibson's father.
Sorry, is it like the moon landing thing? They shot all of it. They built fake concentration camps and stuff, or they.
Yeah, well, the camps, it depends on who you ask about it. Some of them will tell you that they were not real. Some of them will just deny that there was ever an intent to kill people. Mel Gibson's father says that all the Jews went to Brooklyn because 6 million Jews, and let's not forget the 6.5 million Gentiles. But for now, I'm sure Mel Gibson's dad didn't care about them. 6 million Jews would easily be able to hide in Brooklyn.
You mean at the same time that there's document proof that we were turning them away from immigration.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they were all in Brooklyn. He actually said that's where they all went. I'm going to emphasize here, I don't have any evidence that Mel Gibson himself is a Holocaust denier. His father was a Holocaust denier. I don't know if he's still alive. But Mel Gibson grew up in a crazy Holocaust-denying church. I will say that. There's no one consistent Holocaust denial theory. There is no one consistent of any of these. Every single conspiracist I've spoken to has a slightly different perspective on even what sounds like a fairly straightforward thing, because they all have different ways to get around the obvious evidence that they're wrong. It's like trying to talk kinds to a young Earth creationist. What's a kind? Depends on who you ask, when you ask them, and what the context is. How did we fake the moon landing? Ways. Who killed JFK and how did they make it look like it was Oswald? Yeah, it depends on who you ask. Everybody's
What
got...
are vaccines really? It depends.
Huh?
What are vaccines really?
It depends, yeah. What happens if you get vaccinated? Well, autism, or possibly you die or become sterile, or it depends.
I mentioned the first one. The other one was the COVID vaccine gives you, they put microchips in your bloodstream with the COVID vaccine. And I said, well, I'd rather have microchips in my arm than a tube down my throat.
Yeah. Like, oh no, Bill Gates is going to track every move. Like, your phone doesn't do that for you. Like, yeah.
That's why I have an Apple phone. Only Steve Jobs tracked me, not Bill Gates. No kidding.
Right, and he's dead. Actually, he was himself a conspiracist. He tried to treat his cancer with an organic diet, I think. Something ridiculous like that. And look how much good it did for him.
Anyone, like you said, anyone can fall for it.
Anyone can fall for it. You are not too smart to fall for conspiracy theories. You are not too experienced to fall for conspiracy theories. You may have spent too much time around conspiracy theories, but even then you can find yourself... I know some people who went from debunking to, okay, but I do believe this. Yeah, if the government really wants to find you, they're probably going to find you. If it's not like, there aren't a whole bunch of ways to find people that don't require microchips in their arms. Also, go on, find me a microchip small enough to fit into a hypodermic.
What?
Hey, close the door, please. Thank you.
If they can do that nanotechnology, the other thing, if they can have that kind of nanotechnology, they'd be famous.
Yeah. If you could make a microchip that small, just get the patent and be a billionaire. Smart people are much better at building structures to protect their beliefs. I will say that a lot of smart people are also taught how to research better because of the expectation that they will go to college, but that is very much dependent on your school system, and is not a universal. And goodness knows I went to college with some people who believe some stupid conspiracy nonsense. So
I think Dapper's proof that getting a college degree is a college degree. Means you work at AIG. A lot of AIG people have college degrees. Does it mean they're smart?
Yeah, no. But you notice how they never cite their own fields when they're talking about evidence, because they have to know. They have to know the stuff in their field. And that's another thing. This is a big problem with moon hoax stuff. Well, yes, you are from rural Mississippi. I get that. With moon hoax, I do not believe that all 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo missions would have known. That is simply not true, because that 400,000 included literally everyone. It included the astronauts and the mission control guys and the engineers, but it also included the people who made the mission badges and the janitors and the guys who built mission control. Like, that is everybody. And not all of those people would have known. However, one of the reasons I can't make the moon hoax work is that I would go so far as to say at least 10% of those people would have known that the thing they worked on didn't work. Unless they made it so it worked, in which case the thing they worked on worked, and it has to be somebody else's thing that didn't work. But if, 40,000 people all knew that the thing they worked on worked and was what was needed to get to the moon, that's too many people to hide the secret. Secrets don't keep. Both Watergate and Iran-Contra were 18 months from planning to being in the national news. 18 months. And Watergate and Iran-Contra were both much smaller than landing someone on the moon. Yeah, if it was filmed on a film stage, good luck hiding that from the janitors and the cameramen and the people who built the soundstage, because the requirements of that soundstage, people don't realize. But because they all think, well, all of Apollo 1 took place in a fairly small area, and that's true. But Apollo 12 didn't. Apollo 14 didn't. Once they had the rover, the moon buggy, I can't remember what it's actually called suddenly. They went miles in unbroken shots of driving, and you can see the landscape around them change. Where do you film that? Leaving aside the zero gravity thing, leaving aside the, not zero gravity, 1/6 gravity, and the zero atmosphere thing is what I meant. Where do you film that where you can have a black sky the whole time without having obvious, city lights and things, and obvious plants? Lunar rover, thank you. Don't know why my brain went numb on that point. But, there is nowhere you could have filmed that where you didn't have to have an enormous crew of guys, pulling up plants or whatever, leaving aside the other thing that could not have been faked in an outdoor filming location, like wind. It doesn't make sense. And every single person I have ever heard try to make it make sense has a different way of how, no, dude, it totally makes sense if you just do this thing. But they can only explain one thing, and their explanation almost never, works. Again, the guy who said that, well, you just wash the sand and there's no dust. But, the act of rubbing sand particles together creates dust. That's what dust is. And he refused. They'll tell you that the fact that the shadows aren't parallel proves multiple light sources, and you'll give them very simple tests they can do themselves using their own camera and the world around them to prove that shadows are not necessarily parallel, even coming from a single light source, and they won't do the experiment because it could prove them wrong. If you aren't willing to be proven wrong, you're probably wrong. I'm not going to say definitely wrong because, stopped clocks and all that. But if you're not willing to be proven wrong, it's a decent shot that you're just wrong.
All right, so is there a topic you want to talk about in the future?
I mean, I could talk about all kinds of things. I can talk about how a fun topic is the Best Original Song Oscar category, which is a fascinating deep dive. I'm big on movie history. I'm big on A lot of literature stuff, a lot of history stuff. You know, if there's something in particular you'd love to hear me babble about for multiple hours, just let me know, basically.
Cool, we'll discuss it there. As for me, next Saturday, it was supposed to be this Saturday, but he got sick. Tapioca Weasel will be here to talk about atomic physics.
Oh my.
So, going switching gears here, going from whatever conspiracy theories are to science. All right, well, you want to say goodbye?
Yep. Bye, everyone. It's been fun.
As I always say, oh, hold on. Before we go, let's see. Oh, yes.
What? Yep.
We'll discuss that next time. And remember, never stop learning. Mostly believe conspiracy theories, or don't do that. And enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next time. Bye.